The cold seeped into Eleanor's bones before consciousness fully returned, concrete beneath her cheek rough and gritty, the taste of adhesive thick on her tongue where tape sealed her mouth shut. Her wrists burned where zip ties cut into flesh, ankles bound together, and panic crashed through her in waves as memory assembled itself in jagged pieces. Walking to her car after closing the museum, footsteps behind her too close, too fast, a hand clamping over her mouth, the sharp sting in her neck, then nothing until now. Darkness pressed against her eyes, but she could sense space around her, vast and empty, the smell of oil and rust, and something organic rotting in corners. A warehouse maybe, abandoned, far from anyone who might hear her scream if she could scream. Breathing through her nose in short, desperate gasps, Eleanor forced herself to think past the terror, to assess, to survive, but then footsteps echoed across concrete, measured and unhurried, boots against stone, and a figure emerged from shadows that seemed to cling to him like living things. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with predatory grace that made her animal brain scream danger. And when he stepped into the thin moonlight filtering through broken windows above, Eleanor saw a face carved from granite and fury, sharp cheekbones and a jaw that could cut glass, dark hair pushed back from a face too handsome to belong to someone who felt safe, and eyes, God, his eyes, pale and cold and absolutely merciless, as they fixed on her with an intensity that stripped her bare. He crouched before her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne mixed with gunpowder, and without warning or gentleness, he ripped the tape from her mouth in one swift motion that left her gasping and crying out from the sudden pain. "Where did you get it?" he demanded, voice low and dark as midnight, rough velvet wrapped around steel, and Eleanor could only stare at him in confusion and terror, her mouth working soundlessly until he leaned closer, invading her space completely, and asked again with forced patience that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. "Where did you get my brother's ring?" She didn't understand, couldn't process the question through fear and disorientation until his hand moved to her throat and she felt him lift the chain she always wore, the delicate silver chain with the vintage ring she'd bought 6 months ago at an estate sale, a beautiful piece with intricate engraving that had called to her for reasons she couldn't name. "I bought it," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "From an estate sale, an old woman in Riverside. I have a receipt. I didn't steal it, please." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes, something that might have been anguish before it vanished behind iron control, and he stood abruptly, began to pace around her like a wolf circling wounded prey, and Eleanor realized with sickening clarity that she was in the presence of someone truly dangerous, someone for whom violence was not an aberration, but a tool. "You expect me to believe that," he said, not quite a question, "that my brother's wedding ring, the ring he wore the day he disappeared 2 years ago, the ring that vanished with him when James Redmond's people took him, just randomly ended up around your neck." "I don't know anything about that," Eleanor said desperately, trying to twist to keep him in view as he circled. "I'm a museum curator. I collect vintage jewelry. The woman said it was her mother's estate. I never knew." He stopped behind her, and she felt his presence like heat against her spine, felt him radiating controlled fury that terrified her more than open rage, and when he moved again, he was holding a knife that caught the moonlight in a wicked gleam. Eleanor's breath stopped entirely, body going rigid with primal fear, but instead of moving toward her throat, he cut the ties at her ankles, then her wrists, and hauled her roughly to her feet with a hand around her upper arm, his grip bruising and absolute. "You're coming with me," he said, pulling her close enough that she could see gold flecks in those pale, dangerous eyes, "until I determine whether you're lying or just catastrophically unlucky. And either way, you're going to tell me everything you know about that ring and the woman who sold it to you." "Who are you?" Eleanor managed to ask, though her voice shook, and something that might have been grim amusement crossed his face for just an instant before the mask returned. Alexander Carstairs, he said, as if the name should mean something, and when Eleanor's face showed no recognition, his expression hardened further. And you really have no idea who I am, which means you're either the most innocent woman in this city or the best liar I've ever met, and we're going to find out which. His hand on her arm burned where skin met skin, and as he pulled her toward a door she could barely see in the darkness, Eleanor felt her entire ordinary careful life cracking apart, felt herself falling into something vast and dangerous and irrevocable. And beneath the terror something else stirred. Something that recognized the deadly magnetism of the man dragging her into the night. Something that whispered, this was the beginning of everything changing forever. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The drive through darkness felt endless. Eleanor pressed against the passenger door of the SUV with tinted windows so dark she couldn't see out, couldn't orient herself as Alexander drove in silence that felt heavier than any interrogation. His jaw set in granite and his hands tight on the wheel, and she counted her heartbeats trying to calm the panic still flooding her system while her mind spun through impossible scenarios of what happened next. Whether she'd ever see her apartment again, or Catherine, or the museum, or anything from her careful, ordinary life. The city gave way to countryside she could barely glimpse through the windshield, manicured suburbs becoming wild fields, and finally they turned through gates that opened automatically, iron and imposing, topped with cameras that tracked their progress up a long drive lined with trees that looked like centuries in the moonlight. The mansion that emerged from the darkness was fortress and palace combined. 3 stories of pale stone with wings extending on either side, lights blazing from windows on the ground floor, and as Alexander pulled into a circular drive, Eleanor saw figures moving in shadows, men with the alert stillness of trained guards, and her stomach dropped at the full reality of what she'd fallen into. Who this man was, who'd taken her. He came around to her door, opened it himself rather than waiting for her to move, and when she hesitated, his hand closed around her wrist again with that same burning grip, pulling her from the vehicle and toward stairs that led to massive double doors which opened before they reached them, a man in a dark suit nodding to Alexander with military precision. Inside was wealth beyond anything Eleanor had encountered even in her years cataloging estate collections. Marble floors that gleamed like glass, a chandelier dripping crystal overhead, artwork on the walls that she recognized even in her disoriented state as genuine and worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime. And Alexander pulled her through the entrance hall without pause, up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a corridor lined with closed doors to a room at the eastern corner. The bedroom he deposited her in was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in creams and golds, a 4-poster bed dominating the space, French doors leading to what she assumed was a balcony, an attached bathroom visible through an open door, and it was beautiful and luxurious and absolutely a prison as Alexander released her finally and stepped back, putting distance between them that somehow felt more dangerous than proximity. "You'll stay here," he said, voice still that rough velvet that made her skin prickle. "And you'll be provided with anything you need, food, clothing, whatever makes you comfortable while we sort this out. But Eleanor, don't misunderstand the situation. You're not a guest and you're not leaving until I know the truth about that ring and what connection you have to my brother's disappearance. Do you understand?" She nodded, because what else could she do? And Alexander studied her for a long moment with those pale, merciless eyes before turning toward the door. And only when his hand touched the handle did Eleanor find her voice again, hoarse and shaking but determined. "I'm telling you the truth. I don't know anything about your brother. I'm nobody, just a curator who bought a piece of jewelry she liked, and you've made a mistake." His shoulders tensed, and for a moment she thought he might come back toward her, might unleash some of that controlled violence she could feel radiating from him, but instead he spoke without turning, his voice dropping even lower and somehow more threatening for its quietness. "I hope for your sake that's true, Eleanor, because if I find out you've lied to me, If you had any part in what happened to Thomas, there won't be anywhere in this world you can hide from what I'll do to you." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with an ominous click, and she heard the unmistakable sound of a lock engaging from the outside. Eleanor woke to pale morning light filtering through the French doors, disoriented for a moment before reality crashed back, and she remembered where she was. Locked in a gilded cage in the home of a man who could kill her without consequence if he decided she'd been involved in his brother's disappearance. She'd barely slept, lying awake cataloging every detail she could remember about that estate sale 6 months ago, the cramped house in Riverside with its smell of lavender and age, the elderly woman with papery skin and trembling hands sorting through velvet-lined boxes of jewelry, the way the ring had caught the light and called to Eleanor for reasons she couldn't articulate, something about the engraving speaking to her curator's eye. Rising from the too-soft bed, Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at grounds that stretched impossibly far, manicured lawns giving way to thick woods, and guards, at least 6 she could count, moving in patterns that suggested military training, and she understood with sinking certainty that escape wasn't an option, even if she could get past the locked door. She examined the ring again in full daylight, slipping it from the chain around her neck to study the interior band more carefully, and that's when she saw what she'd somehow missed before. Numbers etched so finely into the inner surface that they were nearly invisible. Coordinates, she realized with her heart beginning to race. 42.3154 north and 71.0628 west. And she turned the discovery over in her mind, wondering what it meant, whether telling Alexander would help prove her innocence or damn her further. A knock at the door startled her, and a man entered without waiting for response. Not Alexander, but someone almost as imposing, shorter, but built like a boxer, cold eyes assessing her with professional detachment. "Robert Fleming," he said without preamble, setting a tray of food on the desk near the window, Alexander's second in command, "and you'd be wise to cooperate fully with whatever he asks because his patience isn't infinite and his methods of extracting truth aren't pleasant when that patience runs out." Eleanor lifted her chin despite the fear crawling up her spine. "I've told him everything I know," she said. "I'm not lying about the estate sale or the ring," and Robert's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been assessment or grudging respect. "For your sake, I hope that's true," he said, because Alexander loved his brother more than anything in this world, and Thomas's disappearance broke something in him that hasn't healed, made him harder than he was. And if he believes you had any part in it, he won't rest until he's made you pay. The door locked again behind Robert and Eleanor forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash, needing strength for whatever came next, and she was still turning over the question of the coordinates when evening fell and she heard the lock disengage once more. Alexander entered like a storm front, controlled violence in every line of his body, and Eleanor stood from the chair where she'd been sitting trying to read her racing thoughts, meeting his pale eyes with effort. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the bed, and when she hesitated, his expression hardened. "I'm not going to hurt you, Eleanor, but we're going to talk, and you're going to tell me everything about that estate sale, every single detail you can remember, no matter how insignificant it seems." She sat on the edge of the mattress, and Alexander pulled the desk chair close, too close, invading her space deliberately, and began questioning her with laser focus. "What time of day did you arrive? What did the house look like? Describe the woman in detail. What other items were for sale? Did anyone else come while you were there?" And Eleanor answered as fully as she could, pulling up memories she hadn't thought about in months. The woman's name was Margaret something. Hastings, maybe. The house was a small colonial with peeling blue paint. There were boxes of books and linens and china. Another customer came in briefly but didn't buy anything. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on his knees. So close now Eleanor could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. And despite her fear, she felt her body respond to his proximity, awareness prickling across her skin. "Tell me about the ring," he said, his voice dropping lower. Why that piece? Why did you choose it from everything else there? Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to focus past the way his presence overwhelmed her senses. The engraving was beautiful, she said. Unusual. It felt like it had a story, and I wanted to preserve it. I catalog estate pieces for the museum, and sometimes I acquire items personally, things that speak to me. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, the granite mass cracking just slightly, and she glimpsed the grief beneath, raw and endless, and her heart twisted with unexpected compassion for this dangerous man mourning his lost brother. I need to tell you something, she said, before she could second-guess herself, and reached for the chain around her neck, pulling the ring free and holding it toward him. There are coordinates engraved inside the band. I only noticed them this morning in better light. Alexander went absolutely still, every muscle tensing, and he took the ring from her with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, holding it up to the light to examine the inscription she'd found. And Eleanor watched his face transform, hope and anguish, and something vulnerable flashing across his features before he locked them down again behind iron control. He stood abruptly, turned away from her, and she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "If you're playing me, Eleanor, if this is some elaborate scheme, I swear to God." "I'm not," she interrupted, standing as well though she kept distance between them. "I'm telling you the truth about everything. I didn't know your brother. I've never heard of James Redmond or any of this. I'm just a woman who bought a ring at an estate sale and somehow ended up in the middle of something I don't understand." Alexander turned back to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Intensity and assessment, and something else. Something heated that had nothing to do with anger, and the air between them crackled with tension that was no longer entirely about danger and interrogation. He moved toward her, and Eleanor held her ground, though everything in her screamed both run and closer, and when he stopped just inches away, she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, refusing to show weakness. "Thank you for telling me about the coordinates," he said quietly, and the words felt like more than gratitude, felt like acknowledgement, like the first crack in the wall between them. And then he was gone again, taking the ring with him, and Eleanor sank back onto the bed with her heart racing and her hands shaking, wondering what she'd set in motion and why some part of her was drawn to the deadly beautiful man who held her captive. Why beneath the fear she felt something dangerously close to fascination. The tunnel was narrow and suffocating, rough concrete walls pressing close as Alexander pulled Eleanor forward through darkness, broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly green, and behind them she could hear shouts and gunfire echoing from the compound above. Redmond's men pouring through the breach like a flood, while Alexander's guards bought them time with their lives. Alexander's hand was iron around her wrist, pulling her faster than her legs wanted to move, and twice she stumbled on the uneven floor, only to be caught and dragged forward, his body a wall of controlled urgency beside her, and she could feel his heart pounding where her shoulder pressed against his ribs in the confined space. They emerged finally into underground parking beneath what looked like an abandoned office building, SUV waiting with engine running, and Alexander shoved her into the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel and peeling out with tires screaming. And Eleanor twisted to look back, but saw only darkness and the tunnel entrance already disappearing behind them. The drive through the city was a blur of side streets and sudden turns. Alexander checking mirrors constantly, taking routes that made no logical sense until Eleanor realized he was making sure they weren't followed. And finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, they pulled into the garage of a nondescript apartment building in a neighborhood she didn't recognize. The safe house apartment was small and sparse, functional furniture and bare walls, nothing personal or distinctive, the kind of place designed to be forgotten, and Alexander locked the door behind them with 3 separate bolts, before finally releasing the tension she could see vibrating through his frame, his shoulders dropping slightly as he turned to face her. "You're bleeding," he said, And Eleanor looked down to see blood soaking through her sleeve where she'd scraped her arm on the tunnel wall during their escape, adrenaline having blocked the pain until now, and suddenly it throbbed hot and sharp. Alexander guided her to the couch, disappeared into the bathroom, and returned with a first aid kit, and Eleanor watched as he knelt before her with surprising grace for such a large man, his hands steady and impossibly gentle as he eased her sleeve up to expose the gash. "This might hurt," he warned, and then he was cleaning the wound with antiseptic that burned like fire. But Eleanor bit her lip and stayed silent, watching his face instead of the injury, seeing the concentration in his eyes and the way his jaw tensed each time she flinched. "Tell me about Thomas," she said quietly, needing to understand this man who held her captive and saved her life in the same breath. And Alexander's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "He was 5 years younger than me," Alexander said finally, his voice rough with memory, "the good one in the family, the one who was supposed to get out, go to college, have a normal life, but our father died when Thomas was 17, and suddenly there was no choice. The business needed both of us to survive the transition of power." Eleanor could hear the guilt threading through his words, the weight of responsibility and regret. "He met Catherine his sophomore year at university," Alexander continued, applying bandage with careful precision, "and she was perfect for him, kind and smart and normal, everything our world wasn't. And when they got married, I thought maybe he'd made it out after all, that he could keep one foot in legitimate business and one in our world and balance both. But I was wrong." The last word came out bitter and sharp. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, and Alexander finally met her eyes, and the devastation in his gaze made her chest ache. "James Redmond happened," Alexander said. "Our organizations had been at peace for years, territories respected, business conducted without interference, but Redmond wanted to expand, wanted what we had, and he knew the fastest way to destroy me was through Thomas, through the one person I loved more than power or territory or my own life." His hands had stopped moving, still resting on her arm, warm and grounding. "Thomas disappeared on a Tuesday," Alexander continued, voice dropping to barely above whisper. "Took a meeting that should have been routine, and never came home, and Catherine called me frantic, and I tore the city apart looking for him, but found nothing, no body, no ransom demand, just silence. And that silence has been eating me alive for 2 years, wondering if he suffered, if he called for me, if I could have prevented it, if I'd been smarter or faster or more ruthless." Eleanor reached out with her uninjured arm and touched his face, the gesture instinctive and intimate, and Alexander's eyes widened slightly at the contact before he leaned into her palm, and she felt the tremor that ran through him at that simple comfort. "I lost my parents 3 years ago," she said softly. "Car accident on the interstate. Gone in a moment. And the grief nearly destroyed me, made me question everything about my life, made me feel so alone I could barely function for months, so I understand that silence, that void where someone should be." Alexander turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, the kiss brief but searing, and Eleanor's breath caught at the intimacy of it, the walls between them crumbling under shared loss and understanding. "I brought you into this," Alexander said, straightening but not moving away. "Redmond knows I have you now, knows you matter somehow to finding Thomas, and that makes you a target, makes you ammunition he can use against me, and I should send you somewhere safe, somewhere far from this war." But Eleanor shook her head before he finished speaking. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Those coordinates mean something. They're a clue Thomas left for someone to find. And I want to help you discover what happened to him. I want to see this through." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, respect and desire and dangerous hope mixing together, and when he leaned forward, Eleanor met him halfway. But at the last second he stopped, lips a breath from hers, and pulled back with visible effort. "Not like this," he said roughly. "Not when you're injured and in shock and I'm the man who's keeping you prisoner. When this happens, Eleanor, and it will happen, it needs to be your choice freely made." And Eleanor wanted to argue that it was her choice, that she wanted this despite every rational reason not to. But the moment was already breaking, tension still crackling between them, but the kiss unclaimed, and somehow that restraint made her want him even more. Made her see the honor beneath the ruthless reputation, the man trying to do right even in impossible circumstances. Morning brought pale sunlight through the safe house windows, and Eleanor woke on the small couch where she'd eventually fallen asleep in the early hours. Alexander's jacket draped over her like a blanket, though she didn't remember him covering her. And when she sat up, she found him at the narrow kitchen table surrounded by papers and maps, laptop open, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Dark circles under his eyes, but his focus absolute as he worked. The coordinates had consumed him, she could see that, and she rose and moved to stand behind him, looking over his shoulder at the screen displaying satellite imagery of an industrial area near the waterfront, warehouses and storage facilities in orderly rows. And Alexander glanced up at her with an expression that was almost vulnerable before his mask slid back into place. "The location is here," he said, tapping the screen. "Unit 237 in a storage facility registered to a shell company, and I've had Robert checking ownership records all night. The trail is deliberately obscured, but it eventually traces back to accounts we know Redmond controls." Eleanor's stomach tightened with apprehension and excitement mixed together. This was the first real lead they'd had. The first tangible connection between Thomas and his disappearance and Redmond's organization. Alexander stood and moved to the coffee maker, poured 2 cups with automatic efficiency, and handed one to Eleanor, their fingers brushing in the exchange and that now familiar electricity sparking between them. Tension that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the attraction neither of them could ignore anymore. "Robert is arranging reconnaissance," Alexander said. "We'll watch the facility for 24 hours before making any move, see who comes and goes, determine if it's being monitored," and Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand. "And you'll stay here where it's secure, where I know you're safe while we gather intelligence." Anger flared hot in Eleanor's chest, the assumption that she would simply accept being sidelined, and she set her coffee down with enough force that it sloshed over the rim. "I'm not staying behind," she said. "I'm the one who found the coordinates. I have as much right to see this through as you do." Alexander's expression hardened. "This isn't about rights, Eleanor. It's about keeping you alive. Redmond knows you exist now, knows you matter somehow to this investigation, and putting you anywhere near that storage facility is painting a target on your back." His phone buzzed before she could respond, and he answered with a clipped greeting, listened for a moment, and his face transformed into something terrible, rage and fear mixing into an expression that made Eleanor take an involuntary step backward. "What happened?" she asked when he ended the call, and Alexander looked at her with eyes gone flat and cold. "That was one of my contacts in the police department. Someone tried to access your apartment an hour ago, questioned your neighbors about your whereabouts, and the description matches known associates of Redmond." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, her apartment, her life. Her best friend Catherine, who lived 2 blocks away and met her for coffee every Sunday, all of it exposed now, contaminated by this dangerous world she'd stumbled into. "I need to call Catherine," she said, voice shaking. "She needs to know to be careful." And Alexander was already pulling out a second phone, one of several he seemed to have. "This line is secure," he said. "Monitored but safe. Make it brief and don't tell her where you are." Eleanor took the phone with trembling hands and dialed Catherine's number. And when her friend answered on the second ring with a frantic "Eleanor, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at that familiar voice, at the normalcy it represented, a life that felt impossibly distant now. "I'm okay," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I need you to listen carefully. Some people might come asking about me, men who aren't police. And if they do, you need to tell them you don't know anything, you haven't heard from me, And then you need to call this number immediately. And she recited the number Alexander held up on a piece of paper. Catherine's voice rose in pitch. What's going on? Are you in trouble? Do you need me to come get you? And Eleanor closed her eyes against the concern and love in those questions. No, she said. Don't try to find me. Just promise me you'll be careful, that you'll call that number if anyone approaches you. Catherine promised, though Eleanor could hear the reluctance and fear. And when they disconnected, Eleanor stood holding the phone, feeling like she'd just severed the last connection to her ordinary life. And the grief of it crashed over her in a wave that left her gasping. Alexander was there before she could collapse, arms coming around her, pulling her against his chest, and Eleanor let herself break, sobs tearing from her throat, as the weight of everything, her abduction and captivity, and the violence and danger, and the loss of the safe, predictable world she'd inhabited just days ago, overwhelmed her completely. He held her without speaking, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed firm against her back, grounding her, and gradually the storm passed, leaving her wrung out and exhausted, but somehow steadier, his solid presence an anchor in chaos. I'm sorry, Alexander said quietly against her hair. I'm sorry I brought this into your life, destroyed everything you had, and Eleanor pulled back enough to look up at him, seeing the guilt and anguish in his face, and she reached up to touch his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble under her palm. I'm not sorry, she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. I'm terrified and angry and my life is completely upended, but I'm not sorry because this matters. Finding out what happened to Thomas matters. And you matter. And Alexander's eyes darkened with something intense and hungry, and when he lowered his head, she rose to meet him, and this time there was no pulling back, no restraint, their mouths meeting in a kiss that was desperate and claiming. Weeks of tension igniting between them like gasoline touched by flame. Eleanor gripped his shoulders, and Alexander lifted her against him, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, the kiss deepening. And she could feel his heart hammering against hers through their clothes, could taste coffee and something darker on his tongue, and she wanted to lose herself in this, in him, forget danger and death and complicated morality in the simple truth of desire and connection. The sharp knock at the door broke them apart, both breathing hard, and Alexander set Eleanor down with visible reluctance, his hand lingering at her waist, before he moved toward the door, checking the security panel before opening it to reveal Robert standing in the hallway with an expression that was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the knowledge in his eyes, the awareness of what he'd interrupted. Robert's news cut through the air like a blade. The surveillance team reported movement at the storage facility. Someone had accessed Unit 237 within the last 6 hours, and they needed to move now before the trail went cold. Alexander's demeanor shifted instantly from the man who'd just been kissing Eleanor to the crime lord who commanded an empire, all business and lethal focus, and he was issuing orders to Robert about team composition and extraction routes, while Eleanor stood there still tasting him on her lips, adrenaline and desire mixing into something that made her feel reckless and alive. The drive to the industrial district took 40 minutes through streets that grew progressively emptier and more desolate, warehouses looming like sleeping giants in the darkness. And Eleanor sat in the back seat of the SUV between two of Alexander's men while he rode up front with Robert, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept moving to check the weapon at his hip. They parked 3 blocks from the facility and approached on foot, Alexander's team spreading out to secure the perimeter with the practiced efficiency of soldiers, and Eleanor stayed close to Alexander as he'd ordered, her own gun a cold weight in her jacket pocket, and she wondered distantly if she'd actually be able to use it if the moment came. The storage facility was a sprawling complex of identical units, roll-up doors in endless rows, security lights casting harsh shadows, and Unit 237 was in the back corner, isolated from the others, and Alexander signaled for silence as they approached, Robert moving to pick the lock while the rest of them maintained watch. The door rolled up with a metallic shriek that seemed deafening in the quiet night, and Eleanor's breath caught at what the flashlight beams revealed inside. A space that had clearly been used as a prison, a chair bolted to the concrete floor with restraints still attached, dark stains on the walls and floor that could only be blood, and photographs tacked up in rows showing Thomas at different stages of captivity, his face progressively more haggard and desperate. Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat, and beside her Alexander had gone absolutely still, a stillness that was more terrifying than rage would have been, and she could feel the violence coiling in him, barely contained. Robert was documenting everything with his phone camera, methodical despite the horror, while Alexander moved deeper into the unit like a man in a nightmare. And Eleanor followed because leaving him alone in this place felt impossible. There were more photographs, close-ups of injuries and documents spread on a makeshift table, evidence of systematic torture, and Eleanor saw Alexander's hands shake as he touched the chair where his brother had suffered, and she wanted to comfort him, but there were no words adequate for this. Robert called out that he'd found something, and they moved to where he was prying up a section of floorboard, and beneath was a laptop wrapped in plastic, protected and hidden, clearly placed there deliberately. Alexander lifted it out with careful hands, and Eleanor noticed something in one of the photographs that made her freeze. A woman's hand at the edge of the frame, blurred but visible, and on the wrist was a bracelet she recognized instantly. Distinctive silver links with an unusual clasp, the same bracelet the old woman at the estate sale had been wearing. The connection slammed into Eleanor with the force of revelation. The woman who'd sold her the ring hadn't been a random victim of Redmond's organization. She'd been part of it, present during Thomas's captivity, and that meant the ring hadn't escaped accidentally. It had been deliberately released, a breadcrumb trail Thomas had somehow managed to create. Alexander saw her expression and demanded to know what she'd realized, and when Eleanor explained about the bracelet, his face transformed into something feral, hope and fury mixing together, because if the woman had been involved, then she was a link they could trace, a thread leading back to everyone responsible. They were gathering the laptop and evidence when the first gunshot shattered the night, bullets sparking off metal near Robert's head, and suddenly, there were muzzle flashes in the darkness and men shouting, and Alexander was dragging Eleanor behind a stack of crates while returning fire, and she realized with sick certainty that they'd walked into an ambush, that Redmond had been waiting for them to find this place. The firefight was chaos and terror, bullets tearing through metal, and Eleanor found herself separated from Alexander when part of the unit's wall collapsed. Dust and noise, and then hands grabbing her from behind, dragging her backward, and she screamed his name before remembering the training, the hours he'd spent teaching her to fight, and she drove her elbow back into her attacker's ribs and twisted, reaching for the gun in her pocket. The weapon felt heavy and impossible in her shaking hands, but she remembered Alexander's voice in her ear during their practice sessions. Breathe and squeeze, don't pull. And when the man lunged at her again, she fired, the recoil shocking, and he went down. Eleanor stood frozen, staring at what she'd done before Alexander was there, pulling her behind a shipping container as bullets pinged off metal around them, and they were pinned down, outnumbered, and she could see in his eyes that he was calculating odds and finding them wanting. Alexander positioned himself between Eleanor and the incoming fire, his body a shield, and she realized with crystalline clarity that he was prepared to die here protecting her, that he'd sacrifice himself without hesitation. And the certainty of her feelings crashed over her like a wave. She loved him, loved this dangerous, complicated man who'd kidnapped her and protected her and shown her a strength she'd never known she possessed. "I love you," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out desperate and true, and Alexander turned to look at her with such fierce intensity it stole her breath. And then he was kissing her hard and claiming a promise and a goodbye, and Eleanor kissed him back like she could anchor him to life through sheer force of will, through the truth of what she felt. The sound of engines cut through the firefight, and Eleanor's heart leaped with desperate hope as headlights flooded the storage facility perimeter, Alexander's reinforcements arriving in a coordinated assault that turned the tide instantly. his men pouring from vehicles with military precision, and suddenly Redmond's ambush became a rout, the rival gang members retreating under overwhelming firepower, some falling, others scattering into the darkness beyond the facility. Alexander kept Eleanor pinned beneath him behind the shipping container until Robert gave the all clear, his body still shielding hers, and when he finally pulled back and helped her stand, Eleanor's legs trembled so badly she could barely hold her weight, adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. Alexander's hands moved over her frantically, checking for injuries, his face stark with fear, and she realized he was shaking too. This man who commanded an empire and faced death with cold calculation was trembling as he touched her face and neck and arms, assuring himself she was whole. They made it back to a different safe house across the city, this one larger and more fortified, and Alexander's men swept it thoroughly before allowing them inside. But the moment the door closed and they were alone, the air between them ignited, all the fear and desperation and relief combusting into need. Eleanor reached for Alexander at the same moment he pulled her against him, their mouths meeting in a kiss that was hungry and claiming, and she clutched at his shoulders as he lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her through the unfamiliar space to a bedroom, kicking the door shut behind them. Their clothes became obstacles removed with urgent hands, weapons and body armor discarded. And when Alexander laid Eleanor on the bed and covered her body with his own, she felt like she was finally exactly where she belonged. This dangerous man who'd stolen her from her ordinary life, now the only safety she wanted. Their intimacy was intense and desperate, a claiming born from having faced death together, from the certainty that they could have lost each other, before ever knowing what it could be between them. Alexander made love to her with fierce tenderness, his control fracturing into something raw and real, and Eleanor met him with equal passion, her hands mapping the scars on his body, evidence of a violent life, accepting all of him without reservation. Afterward, they lay tangled together, hearts still racing, and Alexander pulled her close against his chest, one hand stroking her hair with surprising gentleness, and Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks, release of tension and fear and overwhelming emotion. "I love you," Alexander said quietly against her hair, and the words sounded like a confession torn from somewhere deep. "I've never felt this for anyone, never let anyone close enough to matter, and you've destroyed every defense I had, made me want things I stopped believing in years ago." Eleanor turned in his arms to look up at his face, seeing vulnerability there that no one else probably ever witnessed, and she touched his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble under her palm. "I love you too," she said, "and I'm terrified of what that means, of this life and the danger. But I'm not sorry. I choose you." Alexander kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, a promise being made without words, and Eleanor understood that something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd crossed a line from which there was no return, bound together now by more than circumstances, by choice and desire, and a connection forged in fire. The sharp knock at the door made them both tense, and Alexander called out identification protocols before rising and pulling on his pants. And when Robert entered, his expression was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the urgency beneath. "I cracked the laptop password," Robert said, "and you need to see what's on it, both of you, because this changes everything." They dressed quickly and followed Robert to a makeshift office, where the recovered laptop sat open on a desk, files displayed on the screen. And as Alexander and Eleanor read through them, horror and betrayal and terrible understanding washed over them in waves. Thomas hadn't just been held captive and tortured, he'd been forced to work for Redmond, laundering money through legitimate businesses, providing inside information about Alexander's organization, his financial knowledge exploited for months. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, spreadsheets and communications, and Eleanor saw Alexander's face go white with the betrayal of it, his brother working for his enemy, even if under duress. But there was more, deeper in the files, messages Thomas had managed to hide within the data, coded references that showed he'd been fighting back in small ways, trying to sabotage the operations while appearing compliant. And the final entry, dated the day before his death, was a message clearly meant for Alexander, coordinates, and a cryptic reference to insurance, to something Thomas had hidden that could destroy Redmond. The location was coded, but Alexander understood it immediately, his expression shifting to something Eleanor couldn't quite read. "Our childhood home," he said quietly. "The place where we grew up before our father moved us to the estate. Thomas is telling me he hid something there. Evidence Redmond doesn't know about." The childhood home stood at the end of a forgotten lane on the outskirts of the city, a decaying Victorian mansion that time and neglect had transformed into something from a Gothic nightmare. Windows broken and boarded, ivy consuming walls. The property surrounded by rusted iron fencing that had once been grand, but now spoke only of abandonment and loss. Alexander stood for a long moment staring at the house before moving forward, and Eleanor watched emotions play across his face that she'd never seen before, grief and nostalgia, and something almost like fear, and she understood they were walking into the past that had created the man beside her, the place where innocence had died and darkness had taken root. They entered through a side door that Alexander opened with practiced ease, clearly remembering the way even after years away, and inside the air was thick with dust and decay, furniture covered in rotting sheets, water damage staining ceilings, the bones of a home where a family had once lived before violence and crime had consumed it. Alexander led Eleanor through rooms he named quietly, the parlor where his mother used to read, the dining room where family dinners had become increasingly silent as his father's business darkened their lives, and finally up the grand staircase to the second floor where bedrooms waited like tombs of memory. Thomas's room was at the end of the hall, and Alexander hesitated before entering, his hand on the doorframe as if steadying himself, and Eleanor touched his back gently, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this, that she was here beside him through whatever they found. The room was smaller than she'd expected, boyish decorations still visible beneath the decay, posters of bands peeling from walls, a desk by the window where pale light filtered through broken boards, and Alexander moved to the closet with certainty, pushing aside debris and pulling back a section of wall that revealed itself as a false panel, ingenious carpentry hiding a space behind. The safe was old-fashioned, combination lock, and Alexander's fingers moved across it with muscle memory, numbers that clearly meant something to both brothers, and when the lock clicked open, Eleanor's breath caught in anticipation and dread at what they might discover. Inside were documents, folders of papers that Alexander lifted out with careful hands, and as he spread them on the dusty desk, Eleanor leaned close to read and felt shock roll through her at what they revealed. Communications between Redmond and federal agents, financial records showing payoffs and protection agreements, evidence that Redmond had been working both sides for years, using his gang war with Alexander as cover to eliminate other rivals, while federal contacts kept him insulated from consequences. It was explosive information, the kind that could destroy Redmond completely, bring down corrupt officials, dismantle protection networks, and Eleanor understood why Thomas had hidden it so carefully, insurance against the man who'd held him captive. But there was more beneath the documents, a letter in Thomas's handwriting addressed to Alexander, and when Alexander opened it with shaking hands, Eleanor saw his face transform as he read, grief and love and terrible understanding washing over his features. She read over his shoulder, Thomas's words apologizing for weakness, explaining he'd tried to protect his wife Catherine by cooperating with Redmond, describing the impossible choices he'd faced, and then begging Alexander not to seek revenge, to get out of the life instead, to find someone to love and build something better than the violence that had consumed their family. The letter destroyed and rebuilt Alexander simultaneously, and Eleanor wrapped her arms around him from behind as his shoulders shook with silent grief. This man who commanded an empire crying for his lost brother in the ruins of their childhood. The sound of vehicles outside shattered the moment, and Alexander's head snapped up, instinct taking over, and they moved to the window to see black SUVs surrounding the property, armed men taking positions, and Eleanor's heart sank with the realization that Redmond had tracked them here, that this place of memory was about to become a battlefield. Alexander was already moving, gathering the documents and shoving them inside his jacket, pulling Eleanor toward the door while assessing escape routes. But when they reached the hallway, they could hear men entering below, heavy footsteps and shouted commands, and they were trapped on the second floor with no clear way out. They barricaded themselves in Thomas's room, Alexander pushing the heavy desk against the door, while Eleanor stood at the window looking for options. And when he turned to face her, his expression was fierce and tender and full of terrible resolve. "If we don't make it out of this," he said quietly, "I need you to know that you saved me. You made me want to be better, made me believe in something beyond vengeance and violence." Eleanor crossed to him and took his face in her hands. "We're both making it out," she said with certainty she forced herself to feel. "But if somehow we don't, then I need you to know I've never felt more alive than these weeks with you. Never been more myself than when I'm standing beside you facing impossible odds." Alexander kissed her hard and desperate, a claiming and a promise and a goodbye. And then he was handing her a gun and positioning them both to defend the barricaded door, and Eleanor checked the weapon with hands that no longer shook. Her fear transformed into fierce determination to survive this, to build the life they'd found together in darkness and danger. The siege began with gunfire shattering windows and splintering the barricaded door, bullets tearing through rotting wood and plaster, and Eleanor fired back alongside Alexander with steady hands that no longer shook. Her fear transformed into fierce determination to survive this, to protect this man she loved and the future they'd barely begun to build together. Alexander fought with lethal precision, every shot calculated, his body angled to shield Eleanor even as they worked as a unit, moving in synchronization that spoke to how deeply they'd come to know each other. And when the door finally gave way under sustained assault, they fell back to the next defensible position, using furniture and door frames as cover. The sound of more vehicles arriving sent Eleanor's heart racing with hope until she recognized the tactical formation as Robert and Alexander's reinforcements poured into the fight. And suddenly the tide shifted, Redmond's men caught between two forces, but then a voice cut through the chaos, cold and commanding, and James Redmond himself strode into the decaying mansion like he owned it, flanked by personal guards, his attention fixed solely on Alexander with hatred that burned like acid. "Stand down," Redmond ordered his men. "This is between me and Carstairs, always has been." And Eleanor watched in horror as Alexander stepped forward to meet him, the two men circling each other in the ruined parlor, while gunfire continued sporadically outside, and Redmond smiled with vicious pleasure as he began to speak. "Did you really think Thomas died because of business?" Redmond asked mockingly. "It was always personal, Alexander. I targeted your brother specifically because I knew he was your weakness, the conscience you couldn't quite kill, and I wanted to break you completely, wanted to watch you destroy yourself with grief and rage." Alexander's face went white with fury, and Eleanor saw his control fracturing, years of contained violence threatening to explode. But Redmond wasn't finished, circling closer, weapon held loosely, confident in his superior position. "Thomas begged at the end," Redmond continued, "pleaded for his wife's life, for your life, offered me everything if I'd just let him go, and I made sure his death was slow, made sure he knew he'd failed to protect anyone he loved." Alexander lunged, and the two men collided in brutal combat, fists and weapons, and Eleanor watched frozen as they fought with lethal intent, decades of rivalry and hatred pouring out in violence. But Redmond was younger, faster, and he gained the upper hand, slamming Alexander against the wall and pressing a gun to his head. Eleanor didn't think, didn't hesitate. Muscle memory and love and fierce protective instinct taking over as she raised her weapon and fired, the shot catching Redmond in the shoulder and spinning him away from Alexander, and in that moment she crossed a line she'd never imagined crossing, chose violence to protect what she loved. The aftermath unfolded in chaos as Robert's men secured Redmond, the wound serious but not fatal, and Alexander pulled Eleanor into his arms, both of them trembling with adrenaline and emotion, and she realized what she'd done, realized she'd shot a man, possibly taken a life, and her hands started shaking violently. "You didn't have to do that," Alexander said against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have stayed safe. Let me handle it." Eleanor pulled back to look at his face, seeing blood and exhaustion and overwhelming love there. "I chose to," she said fiercely. "Chose you, chose this life, chose us, and I'd make the same choice again without hesitation." Alexander kissed her desperately, tasting like blood and smoke and promise, and when Robert approached with Redmond secured and awaiting Alexander's judgment, Eleanor saw her lover face the defining choice: revenge as the old Alexander would have demanded, or mercy as Thomas had begged for in his final letter. She didn't tell him what to do, didn't try to influence his decision, but she took his hand and held it, a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore in the darkness, that he had something to live for beyond vengeance, someone who would stand beside him, whatever choice he made. Alexander stood in the ruined parlor holding Eleanor's hand and looking at James Redmond restrained on the floor, bleeding from the shoulder wound she'd given him, and in that suspended moment, he felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this point, every act of violence that had hardened him into the man his father had wanted, the man Thomas had feared he'd become. And he could feel the pull of old instincts demanding he finish this the way his world had always demanded, with blood and finality and the kind of justice that left no room for mercy or second chances. Eleanor didn't speak, didn't tell him what to do, but her hand in his was steady and warm, and somehow that simple contact reminded him of everything he'd discovered these past weeks, that there were other ways to be strong, other choices beyond the ones he'd always made, and he thought about Thomas's letter begging him to find a different path, to choose something better than the cycle of vengeance that had consumed their family for generations. Robert approached cautiously with several men, waiting for orders, and Alexander saw the expectation in their faces. They knew what usually happened to enemies who'd caused this much damage, who'd killed family, who'd tried to destroy everything Alexander had built. But when Alexander spoke, his voice was calm and certain in a way that surprised even himself. "Take him to the federal building," he said. "We're turning him over to the authorities along with all the evidence Thomas gathered. Let him face consequences from every side he betrayed." The shock on Robert's face was almost comical, but he moved to obey immediately, and Redmond laughed bitterly from the floor. "You've gone soft, Carstairs. The woman's made you weak." And Alexander crouched down to look him in the eye, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "I'm giving you to people you sold out, to federal agents whose colleagues you corrupted, to criminal organizations you used and discarded, and letting them all know exactly what you did," he said quietly. "Death would be kinder than what's waiting for you, so don't mistake mercy for weakness." He stood and turned back to Eleanor, pulling her close as Robert's men dragged Redmond away, and she looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "That was the right choice," she said softly. "The one Thomas wanted you to make." In the days that followed, Alexander began the dangerous work of transforming his organization, reaching out to contacts in legitimate business, divesting the most violent operations. And it was treacherous work, because rivals circled sensing weakness, and some of his own people questioned the changes. But Eleanor stood beside him through all of it, her presence a reminder of why he was choosing this harder path. Catherine Langley was found in a small town 200 miles away, living under an assumed name. And when Alexander's men brought her to the city under protection, she was terrified until she saw Eleanor, and recognition flashed across her face as she stared at the ring hanging around Eleanor's neck. "I sold that," Catherine whispered. "After Thomas disappeared, I had to go underground, had to liquidate everything to survive. I never knew where any of it ended up." Eleanor took her hands gently. "It found its way to me, and through it I found Alexander, and together we found the truth about what happened to Thomas." Catherine broke down then, grief and relief and residual terror pouring out, and Alexander arranged for her protection and a substantial financial settlement, enough that she'd never have to fear or struggle again. And watching him care for his brother's widow with such attention, Eleanor saw the man Thomas had believed Alexander could become. The protector rather than destroyer, the builder rather than conqueror. Their relationship deepened in those weeks of transition, moving beyond the crisis-forged intensity into something more sustainable, partnership built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. And Eleanor found herself integrated into Alexander's world in ways she'd never imagined, using her analytical skills from years of museum curation to help legitimize operations, connecting with the few other women in this male-dominated sphere, learning the complex codes and hierarchies that governed everything. Alexander watched her adapt with a mixture of pride and continued amazement that she'd chosen him, stayed when she could have walked away to safety, and he proposed to her not with grand gestures but with raw honesty one night, as they reviewed financial documents together. "I want you beside me forever," he said simply. "Equal partners in everything we build, in this dangerous, complicated life we're choosing together." Eleanor accepted without hesitation, and they began planning a small private wedding, something that honored the gravity of what they'd survived while acknowledging the precarious reality they still inhabited. But Eleanor felt settled in a way she hadn't since her parents died, felt purposeful and needed and part of something larger than herself. Eleanor tried to return to some semblance of normalcy in the weeks following their engagement, going back to her position at the museum where ancient artifacts and climate-controlled galleries had once been her entire world. But everything felt different now. The quiet halls and careful preservation of the past seeming almost quaint compared to the dangerous present she inhabited, and she found herself constantly aware of Alexander's security, watching from discreet distances, the protection both comforting and confining in equal measure. She was cataloging a new acquisition of Renaissance jewelry when it happened, stepping out the staff entrance into the alley behind the museum at the end of her shift, her mind occupied with thoughts of the wedding plans and whether Catherine would be comfortable attending given her own complicated grief. And she didn't notice the van until it was too late, didn't see the men moving from the shadows until hands grabbed her and something pressed over her mouth and nose, chemical sweet and overwhelming, and her last conscious thought was of Alexander and how terrified he would be when he found out. She woke in motion, vehicle moving beneath her, and muscle memory from her first kidnapping months ago kicked in immediately, keeping her breathing steady and eyes closed while she assessed the situation. Hands zip-tied in front of her this time, rather than behind, ankles bound, but not to anything fixed, and she could hear two voices in the front seat discussing routes and timing. One of them was on the phone reporting success to someone he called Sir, saying they had the woman and were heading to the location, and Eleanor's heart raced, but her mind stayed clear, remembering everything Alexander had taught her about staying calm under pressure, about watching for opportunities rather than panicking. The voice on the phone mentioned Redmond's name with reverence, and Eleanor understood. This was one of the deposed crime lord's remaining loyalists, seeking revenge for his downfall and imprisonment, targeting her because hurting Alexander's woman was the cruelest blow they could land, and she felt anger mix with her fear because she was so tired of being used as a weapon against the man she loved. She worked at the zip ties carefully, remembering the technique Alexander had shown her involving creating tension and finding the locking mechanism. And after long minutes, she felt them loosen slightly, enough that she thought she could slip free when the moment came. The van slowed for what sounded like a turn, and Eleanor made her move, lurching upward and slamming her bound hands into the driver's head, and in the chaos that followed as the vehicle swerved, she managed to kick open the rear door and roll out onto pavement. The impact brutal but survivable, and she was running before her captors could recover, zip ties finally breaking as she sprinted into the maze of industrial buildings surrounding her. She had no phone, no weapon, no idea where she was exactly, but Alexander had prepared her for this too, taught her about safe houses and coded signals, and how to leave trails for his people to follow. And she found a piece of broken glass and used it to tear a strip from her shirt, tying it to a fence post at an intersection the way he'd shown her, a marker his searchers would recognize. She broke into an abandoned warehouse and made her way to the upper levels where she could watch the streets below, and using techniques born from desperation and training, she began leaving more signs, arranging debris in patterns that would mean something to Alexander's people. And then she settled in to wait, knowing he would be looking, knowing he would tear the city apart to find her. Hours passed and Eleanor watched her captors searching below. More men arriving, and she recognized the tactical precision of their search pattern. These weren't amateurs, but trained soldiers from Redmond's old organization, and she knew she couldn't hide forever, would eventually need to move or be discovered. As darkness fell, she made her way through connected buildings using maintenance catwalks and service corridors, always moving toward areas she thought might have cameras or witnesses, leaving her trail of signs, and finally she reached a neighborhood she recognized, one where Alexander had pointed out a safe house weeks ago during a drive. The apartment was in a converted industrial building, and Eleanor broke in through a fire escape window, finding it sparsely furnished but functional, and most importantly there was a phone with a secure line, numbers programmed in, and her hands shook as she dialed the code Alexander had made her memorize. Robert answered within 2 rings, and Eleanor identified herself with the passphrase, giving her location, and his voice was tight with relief as he said Alexander had mobilized everything looking for her, that he'd been like a man possessed since her security detail reported her taken. Eleanor heard a vehicle screech to a halt outside, and for a moment feared her captors had found her, but then Alexander was there, taking the stairs 3 at a time, and when he burst through the door, his face was a mask of fear and rage and relief so intense it took her breath away, and she ran to him, both of them colliding in an embrace that felt like coming home after war. Alexander held Eleanor so tightly in the safe house that she could barely breathe, but she didn't complain because she understood the terror that had driven him through the city, tearing apart every location and contact until he found her. And when he finally pulled back enough to look at her, his hands came up to frame her face, with a gentleness that belied the violence still humming through his body. The contrast making her heart ache with love for this complicated, dangerous man who'd somehow become her entire world. "You scared me," he said, and his voice was raw in a way she'd rarely heard. "I thought I'd lost you, thought I'd have to live knowing you died because of me, because loving me made you a target." Eleanor covered his hands with hers and held his gaze steadily. "I'm not dead," she said. "I'm here, and I'm capable, and we need to talk about the fact that hiding me away isn't going to work, that the only way forward is to eliminate the threat completely." Alexander's jaw tightened, and she could see him wanting to argue, wanting to lock her somewhere safe where enemies could never reach. But Robert cleared his throat from the doorway and said they had intelligence on the lieutenant's location, that the man was gathering forces for another attempt, that this was escalating into open warfare. Eleanor straightened in Alexander's arms and said, "Then we end it. We use me as bait and draw him into a trap." And Alexander's immediate refusal was vehement and absolute. "No, never again. I won't risk you like that." But Eleanor had been thinking about this during her hours alone evading capture, had been formulating a plan born from desperation and determination, and she laid it out now with careful logic, explaining how they could control the situation this time, how Alexander's people could surround her with protection while making it look like she was vulnerable, how they could finally finish what Redmond had started and eliminate the last real threat to their future together. Alexander paced the small room like a caged predator, everything in him rebelling against using the woman he loved as bait, but Robert was nodding slowly and adding tactical suggestions, and Eleanor pressed her advantage by pointing out that the lieutenant already knew she was Alexander's weakness, that he'd keep coming for her no matter what they did, that the only choice was between reacting defensively or taking offensive action on their terms. The argument stretched for an hour, Alexander finding every reason why it was too dangerous, while Eleanor countered each objection with calm determination. And finally, he agreed, but only with conditions, layers of protection and backup plans, and the understanding that at the first sign things were going wrong, they'd abort and extract her. They spent the next 2 days planning meticulously, setting up the trap at a location Robert's intelligence suggested the lieutenant was already watching, a gallery opening Eleanor was supposedly attending as she tried to return to normal life, and the irony of using her old world as the staging ground for this violent confrontation wasn't lost on her. Alexander barely left her side during the preparation, his protective instinct in overdrive. And the night before the operation, he made love to her with desperate intensity, as though trying to memorize every touch and taste in case something went wrong, and afterward he extracted promises from her to follow the plan exactly, to trust his people, to run if he gave the signal. Eleanor promised even as she privately vowed to do whatever was necessary to survive, to eliminate this threat so they could finally build the life they'd fought for. And when the night of the trap arrived, she dressed in the elegant gown Alexander had provided and put on the wire that would keep her connected to his team and tried to quiet the fear trembling through her hands as she prepared to walk into danger one more time. The gallery opening that served as the trap unfolded with elegant precision at first, Eleanor moving through crowds of art patrons in her midnight blue gown, while Alexander's security team positioned themselves throughout the venue disguised as guests and staff. And she could feel the wire against her skin reminding her that Alexander was listening to every sound, watching through concealed cameras, ready to move the moment danger materialized. The lieutenant made his move 40 minutes into the event, his team infiltrating through service corridors that Robert's intelligence had predicted they'd use. But the numbers were wrong. Twice as many men as expected flooding into the gallery, and Eleanor heard Alexander's voice tight with controlled panic in her earpiece, telling her to move to extraction point Alpha immediately. She started toward the designated exit, but gunfire erupted near the main entrance. Panicked civilians screaming and running, and in the chaos she saw Alexander's men engaging the attackers while trying to protect innocents caught in the crossfire, the careful plan dissolving into violence and disorder. Eleanor fought her way through the stampeding crowd, her training keeping her low and moving, but strong hands grabbed her from behind, and she recognized the lieutenant's voice in her ear, saying, "Gotcha," as he dragged her backward through a service door his inside source had left unlocked. The mole had provided layouts and security positions, giving the lieutenant advantages that turned Alexander's trap inside out, and Eleanor realized with cold clarity that she was genuinely captured now. No backup plan in place because this wasn't supposed to happen. The lieutenant forced her into a delivery van waiting in the alley, 3 more of his men surrounding her, and as they pulled away she could hear Alexander's voice in her earpiece calling her name with desperate urgency before rough hands found the wire and ripped it away, severing her connection to the man she loved. They drove for 20 minutes while Eleanor assessed her captors and situation, noting the lieutenant's nervous energy and the way his men kept checking weapons, all of them wound tight, with the knowledge that Alexander Carstairs would be coming for her with everything he had. The lieutenant noticed her watching and smiled without humor, saying Alexander's woman, his weakness. "I'm going to kill you where everyone can see and watch him break. Watch the mighty Carstairs empire crumble because he let himself care about something." Eleanor kept her voice steady as she said, "Killing me won't break him. It will unleash him. You have no idea what you've started." But the lieutenant just laughed and said, "That's exactly what I'm counting on. Redmond's legacy will be Alexander's destruction, one way or another." They took her to an abandoned theater in the arts district, the lieutenant explaining almost conversationally that he'd chosen the location for its symbolic value and its multiple camera angles, planning to stream her execution live to ensure Alexander saw every moment. Eleanor was bound to a chair on the decaying stage, theatrical lights rigged to illuminate her like some grotesque performance, and the lieutenant set up cameras while his men secured entrances and took positions, and she could see they expected Alexander's assault, were prepared for it, wanted it. Her mind raced through possibilities and escape attempts while the lieutenant monologued about loyalty to Redmond and revenge for his imprisoned boss. And Eleanor understood that this man was driven by something beyond rational calculation, that grief and rage had made him reckless and dangerous in ways that made him unpredictable. She tested her bonds carefully while appearing defeated and terrified, finding them professionally tight but not impossible. And she remembered Alexander's lessons about patience and timing, about waiting for the moment when enemies' attention divided. The lieutenant's phone rang and he answered with obvious satisfaction, saying, "Yes, Mr. Carstairs, I have her. Come to the Orpheum Theater alone and unarmed if you want to see her alive." And Eleanor's heart clenched hearing Alexander's response even filtered through the phone, a cold promise of destruction that made even the lieutenant's confidence waver momentarily before he recovered and gave coordinates and a 30-minute deadline. Eleanor stared at the photograph in her hands the night before her wedding, the image of Thomas Carstairs alive and clearly recent, burning itself into her vision. And her first instinct was to hide this from Alexander, to investigate alone and protect him from potential cruelty. But she realized immediately that keeping this secret would be a betrayal of everything they'd built together, the partnership and trust that had become the foundation of their relationship. She found Alexander in his office reviewing security arrangements for the wedding. And when he looked up and saw her expression, his entire body went rigid with alarm. "What happened?" he demanded, crossing to her in 3 strides, and she wordlessly handed him the photograph and watched his face transform through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock and hope and disbelief and fear, all chasing across features that had learned to hide everything. "That's impossible," Alexander said, his voice hoarse. "We found evidence of his death, Redmond's records, the timeline." But his hands were shaking as he held the photograph, and Eleanor could see him wanting desperately to believe despite every logical reason not to. She showed him the note with its coordinates and the promise of truth, and Alexander's jaw tightened as he recognized the numbers. "Those are the same coordinates from the ring," he said, "where this all started. Which means someone knows everything, knows about us and Thomas, and is using that knowledge now." Robert was summoned immediately, and he examined the photograph with professional scrutiny before confirming what they needed and dreaded to hear. "It's recent, taken within the last week based on the background details and Thomas's appearance, which means either he's alive or someone has created an extremely sophisticated forgery for purposes we don't yet understand." Alexander wanted to go to the coordinates immediately, was already reaching for his keys and calling his security team, but Eleanor caught his arm and said, "Wait, think about this. It's too convenient, too perfectly timed for the night before our wedding. Someone wants us off balance and reactive." The rational part of Alexander understood her caution, but the brother who'd grieved for 2 years was already spiraling into desperate hope, and Eleanor watched him war with himself before finally agreeing that they'd approach this carefully, with full security protocols and the assumption of potential threat. They spent the next 4 hours planning the approach, Robert coordinating teams and backup positions, while Eleanor researched the specific warehouse location, and Alexander alternated between studying the photograph like it held secrets in its pixels and pacing with barely contained energy. By dawn, they were ready, a 12-person security team positioned around the industrial district location, snipers on roofs and vehicles blocking escape routes, everything designed to turn a potential trap into a controlled encounter. Eleanor dressed in tactical clothing Alexander had provided, the weight of the gun at her hip now familiar, and she caught Alexander's hand as they prepared to leave, squeezing hard. "Whatever we find, we face it together." The warehouse was decrepit and silent when they arrived, Robert's team clearing it room by room while Alexander and Eleanor waited in armored vehicle. And when Robert radioed that they'd found a single occupant, unarmed, claiming to be a lawyer, Eleanor felt Alexander's tension ratchet even higher. They entered together to find a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, sitting calmly at a folding table, his hands visible and empty, and he stood when they approached, saying, "Mr. Carstairs, Ms. Thornhill, thank you for coming. My name is David Morrison, and I represent your brother Thomas, who is very much alive and wishes to see you." The lawyer stepped aside, and a door at the back of the warehouse opened, and Thomas Carstairs walked through it, thinner than Eleanor had seen in photographs, marked by suffering in the lines around his eyes and the way he moved carefully like someone still healing from invisible wounds. And Alexander made a sound Eleanor had never heard from him, something broken and raw, as he crossed the space in 4 strides and pulled his brother into an embrace that looked like it might crush them both. Thomas was shaking, and Alexander was too, both men clinging to each other, while years of grief and guilt and desperate hope poured out in wordless communion. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, watching these 2 dangerous men reduced to the brothers they'd been before violence and loss had carved them into harder shapes. When they finally pulled apart, both their faces were wet, and neither attempted to hide it. And Thomas looked at Eleanor with recognition and gratitude as he said, "You must be Eleanor, the woman who saved my brother in all the ways that matter. Thank you for bringing him back from the darkness I left him in." Alexander kept one hand on Thomas's shoulder like he needed the physical contact to believe this was real, as Thomas explained everything in a voice roughened by emotion. How federal agents had raided the storage facility during what was supposed to be his execution, how Redmond's betrayal of his government contacts had made him a target, how Thomas had been offered witness protection in exchange for testimony about the corrupt agents and Redmond's operation. He'd been in a medical facility for 6 months recovering from his injuries, then relocated under a new identity while the case built, forbidden from contacting anyone from his old life, no matter how desperately he wanted to, forced to watch from afar as Alexander spiraled deeper into darkness and Catherine went into hiding, and his entire world continued without him. Thomas's voice broke as he said, "I saw the newspaper reports about you, Alex. The things you did after I disappeared, and I knew it was my fault. Knew you thought I was dead, and it was destroying you. But I couldn't reach out without compromising everything." Alexander's jaw was tight as he said, "I would have burned the world down if I'd known you were alive, would have torn apart witness protection and federal agencies and anyone who kept you from me." And Thomas nodded, saying, "I know. That's why they made me wait. Made me stay hidden until Redmond was neutralized and his organization dismantled." Eleanor asked quietly about Catherine, and Thomas's entire body tensed with longing as he said, "Is she safe? Is she alive? I couldn't get information about her. They wouldn't tell me anything except that she'd gone underground." And Alexander assured him that Catherine was protected, that they'd found her, and she was waiting at a secure location to see him if he wanted that. The lawyer interjected then with the harsh practicalities, explaining that Thomas could maintain his protected identity and disappear forever into his new life with guaranteed safety, or he could reclaim his old identity and reconnect with Catherine and Alexander, but lose federal protection and accept whatever risks remained from Redmond's remaining associates or other enemies who might surface. Thomas didn't hesitate before saying, "I choose my family. I've been dead for 2 years, and I won't waste another day of the life I've been given." And Alexander gripped his brother's shoulder hard, pride and fear mixing in his expression as he understood the courage that choice required. Within 2 hours, Catherine arrived at the warehouse under heavy guard, and her reunion with Thomas was devastating in its intensity, both of them collapsing into each other, while Eleanor and Alexander gave them privacy, and Alexander pulled Eleanor close and said, "Thank you for making me tell you about the photograph, for not letting me face this alone. I don't know how I would have survived this without you." The next days were complicated navigation of Thomas's re-entry into a world that believed him dead, and Alexander used every resource to create a secure situation while Thomas and Catherine reconnected and began healing together from their separate ordeals. And Eleanor watched Alexander transform further as his brother's return gave him permission to hope for futures beyond vengeance and violence. Their wedding was postponed by a week to allow Thomas time to stabilize, and when Eleanor finally walked through the garden of Alexander's estate toward the man waiting for her under an arch of white flowers, Thomas stood beside his brother as best man, disguised with colored contacts and different hair, but unmistakably present. And the joy on Alexander's face as Eleanor reached him was blinding in its intensity.